Welcome back to another edition of the Bring the Juice podcast. I am your co-host, Cody Felger, and joining me tonight, he's been on the show a lot recently, the great Andrew Thomason. Andrew, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing well, Cody. I'm excited. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, and I'm excited, especially for this episode. And I kind of previewed it and on Twitter and said it's a little bit of a hot topic. Could potentially be a hot topic type of episode here, and more of a hot topic not for Colts fans, but for fans of the Titans, the Texans, or the Jaguars. The AFC South opponents. Because the title of this episode, and we're going to give our reasons. I know, Andrew, you're going to do the offense, and I'm going to do the defense here. But the title of this episode is why we believe that the Colts have the best offensive line and best defensive line out of all of the teams in the AFC South. And if you don't agree with our opinion, that's totally fine. This is just our take on why we believe that the Colts do boast the best line on both sides of the ball with some of the recent moves in free agency. Obviously, we are recording this before the draft happens, about a month before the draft happens. So a lot can change in those, these few weeks leading up to the draft. But based off of what we've been told and based off of what we've seen now this past week in free agency with some of the AFC, some of the defensive linemen moving out of the AFC South primarily, we're going to kind of give our take on why we think that this is the case. So, Andrew, I know you wanted to start with the offense here. Start specifically with the offensive line. The Colts offensive line was one of the better ones in football. It's been one of the best offensive lines in football now for 2 years. Obviously weren't as good statistically as they were when Andrew Luck was a quarterback there in 2018, but the Colts had all of their starters come back again. All of those guys, all 5 starters, basically play every game. And we're one of the better units in the league. So why do you think out of these 4 AFC South teams, the Colts have the best offensive line out of all of them?
I really think it starts with your center guard position. And it's not to say that the tackles aren't important because, they are. But when you have a guy like a Quentin Nelson, a Ryan Kelly, and Mark Glowinski blocking for you and protecting from that interior, it certainly makes things easier for the quarterback with the ability to step up into the pocket when needed. You talk about the running game. The Colts, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, last season were top 10 in rushing, and it was primarily due to the center guard combination. And then, turning the switch here, if you will, you look at the offensive tackles. Costanzo, even though he's up there, I think he's going to be 32, or maybe he already is. He's one of the better left tackles in football. And then Braden Smith, who we took a few years ago, the same draft, I believe, that we took Darius Leonard and Quentin Nelson, he transformed nicely from a right guard into a right tackle. So, the Colts, I don't think it's close, honestly, Cody. When you look at the Jaguars' offensive line, they have some nice pieces. Brandon Linder, the center, is somebody who I really, really like. Jawan Taylor, the right tackle, I think could potentially be a nice piece. Andrew Norwell, funny enough, he was a free agent a few years ago that I think the Colts were pretty high on. He's an okay guard. He's not. I don't think he's one of the better left guards in football. You could probably see why Chris Ballard passed on him a few free agencies ago. And then you look at the Texans' offensive line. Not much really needs to be said, honestly. No disrespect to them, but their left tackle is about all that they have. Max Sharping, who I think they took in last year's draft, is a nice left guard, but they need help on the right side particularly. And then you look at the Titans' offensive line. I could maybe say that the Titans' offensive line is slightly better in run blocking than the Colts, and the only reason I would say that is because the Titans led the league in rushing, so you can make an argument for that. And as far as pass blocking is concerned, I think that when you compare the two, the Colts and Titans, that is, I don't think the Titans come anywhere near the same stratosphere, if you will, as the Colts do. And then, Jack Conklin, the right tackle, just signed a 3-year deal with the Cleveland Browns. And so that's a major, major loss for the Titans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the Jaguars also. I mean, they just – I feel like they had never really had a very good offensive line. What do you think about the Jaguars' offensive line?
It's solid. Cam Robinson, the left tackle they drafted out of Alabama a few years ago or a few drafts ago. Andrew Norwell, the left guard, I already mentioned. I like Brandon Leonard, the center. And then the right guard's kind of been a revolving door for them. AJ Khan or Can, I believe, was the right guard this past season. And then they took Jawan Taylor in the second round. Oddly enough, the Jawan Taylor was projected to be a first-round pick this past draft, and he sort of fell to the second round. And who knows, maybe they'll sort of come together, sort of like the Colts have done these last few years, and become one of the better offensive lines in football. They're certainly not bad. Middle of the pack is probably where I would put them, though.
Yeah, and when comparing it with the Colts offensive line, which we would consider top 5 in the league, it just doesn't match up. It just doesn't work. It doesn't really compare, I guess. And I think one thing that you mentioned, Andrew, which I think is huge for the Colts, is overall just continuity among the offensive line. I mean, you mentioned it. The Titans lost Jack Conklin to free agency. And so the Titans will not in the 2020 season have all of their 2019 starters intact again. But the Colts will. I mean, they have all these guys signed through. They just brought back Costanzo on a 2-year deal. Quentin Nelson, obviously, they drafted a couple years ago, as well as Braden Smith. They extended Mark Glowinski, and it looks like they'll pick up that 5th-year option on Ryan Kelly and probably try to extend him soon. So really, the Colts are in a good place as far as their offensive line is concerned. It's kind of interesting because they have the veteran presence of Costanzo over there, who I think is only getting better with age, and I think he would agree with that, and feels like he can even improve even more, which is absolutely nuts to think about. But I know he's said, and he's been quoted in saying, "This is the best I've ever felt." And he's, that was last off season. So over the age of 30, Costanzo is feeling in the best football shape that he's ever felt. So that can give you certainly some hope that he could even get better as an overall player. I feel like these last couple of years, Costanzo has just been easily a top 10 left tackle in this league, and he's continuing to improve. And I felt like this last season was his best. And Jim Irsay says that as well. So that is definitely something that is a huge factor for that offensive line. And I think there's a good argument to be made there, Andrew, that this offensive line for the Colts, I feel like they were in some ways limited by Jacoby Brissett, and we can say that about the entire offense. Obviously the lack of health among the wide receivers factored into that. But when you go from an elite quarterback to I would say an average to below average quarterback, it's going to impact your offensive line. And I think we saw some of the things that the Colts were able to kind of, I don't want to say cover up, sweep under the rug, but they were able to do a lot more things with Andrew Luck. And Andrew Luck obviously is a lot more mobile than Jacoby Brissett and can get you out of some of those pinches you find yourself in. And so I would agree, Andrew. I would think that the Colts have, out of all of these AFC South teams, based off of continuity, based off of what they have done with these 5 starters, I would say that the Colts right now is, in terms of top, all 5 starters have the best offensive line all around. I think the question that'll come up for me, Andrew, is that offensive line depth. And this is something that we've talked about on the podcast is, the Colts lost 2 of their key backups last year, 2 of their key reserve guys in Joe Haeg and then also in Josh Andrews last year. They both, filled in for different spots. Andrews filled in for Ryan Kelly in that Pittsburgh game. And then, he just really, Joe Haeg just is kind of everywhere. Wherever you need him to play, he'll play. And they re-signed Raven Clark, and there's really no depth beyond Raven Clark at this point. So that would be my only hesitation if there's some people saying, well, what about the depth? What do you think about the Colts' depth, and what do you think they need to do? If the depth is the thing that's holding them back, what do they need to do in order to solidify that and have, securely keep their spot here at the number 1 offensive line in the AFC South?
I think you have to address it immediately. Chris Ballard, he's always talking about being obsessed with both the offensive and defensive line, and that includes depth. And when you lose 2 key guys like a Josh Andrews and a Joe Haeg, who was sort of the, as you mentioned, Cody, the Swiss Army knife, if you will, of the offensive line for the last several years. Those are 2 key losses, and I think Chris Ballard would be smart, it would be wise for the Colts to look at maybe drafting a couple offensive linemen, maybe in the later rounds, 3rd, 4th round, guys that you can maybe develop over time. But it's certainly something that they need to address sooner rather than later.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I want to kind of shift it over to the defensive line. I feel like this one might be a little more controversial as far as the defensive line, because in the past, I mean, really, ever since I don't know how long. It's been a long time. I would have never said, I could have not really had anything to stand on to say the Colts have the best defensive line in their division. Like, there was nothing, in the Ryan Grigson era and even up to this point in the Chris Ballard era that would have me saying the Colts have a better defensive line than the Titans, than the Texans, and the Jaguars. In fact, last year I probably would have said maybe the Colts have the worst defensive line in terms of, players that the other teams have compared to the Colts. But I want to make the argument here for why I believe the Colts do have the best defensive line as it stands right now in free agency. And I'll start first here by just kind of listing out the Colts starters, projected starters, I should say. Obviously, the draft has to happen, and it maybe could shift some of this, but I don't really see it happening. You start those defensive tackle positions. You got DeForest Buckner, obviously, the guy the Colts traded the number 13th pick for. I mean, this guy, what can you say about him? He's been super productive the last few years with the 49ers. He was a captain on that defense last year. I remember him getting a sack in that Super Bowl against Patrick Mahomes and company. He's just the type of player that you're looking to get. He's the type of player that is worth that 13th overall pick. And I know that we made a video, Derek made a video, I should say more so, about why he believes that DeForest Buckner was well worth at number 13th pick, and amongst other things. In that video, man, that video is kind of going crazy right now in terms of views and in terms of just likes and all that stuff. So definitely check that one out. It's basically titled "Why the Colts Went from a B-list team to an A-list team." So if you haven't watched that video, I would highly encourage you to check that one out. Derek does a fantastic job there. But DeForest Buckner, he's just a guy that is, if you use kind of the NFL phrasing a little bit or football phrasing, he's kind of a dog on that defensive line. I mean, he's the guy that's going to be a game wrecker type of player. Now, I don't want to say he's Aaron Donald because he's not Aaron Donald. Aaron Donald is in a whole other league of his own. But saying that, DeForest Buckner now, in the last 2 years, really the last 3 years, he's played all 16 games, so he's very durable, which is one thing. He's super productive. I mean, in 2018, he didn't have Nick Bosa or Dee Ford, so it allowed him to get more, I guess, stats. And he had 12 sacks as that, interior defensive lineman. And then this last season, even with those guys, he still had 7.5 sacks. He was second-team All-Pro. I believe he was a Pro Bowl alternate this last year. But he's shown, man, when he doesn't have a ton around him, he can be super productive and he can pick up the slack there. He's young. You mentioned he just turned 26, I believe. So he's a guy that that the Colts believe, want to build their defense around. He's a defensive centerpiece, and the Colts obviously made him one of the highest defenders in the league at that position for a reason, because they believe that he can do that. Danico Autry, who's a guy that, Andrew, you and I were super high on Danico Autry. If you remember back this last offseason, I mean, he was a guy that came in, he was a low, he didn't really think about it when he got in. We were like, who is Danico Autry? But then he came in, I remember in 2018, he was injured a little bit, didn't play all 16 games, but he had 9.5 sacks. He was super productive when he was in there. He was pushing the pocket. He was getting sacks, getting quarterback hits. He was doing all this stuff. And we're like, oh man, the sky's the limit for Danico Autry, right? He's a guy that is going to ascend. Maybe he becomes a Pro Bowler. Maybe he even scratches all pro. Like, he was that productive in 2018. And then in 2019, it seems like a lot of things just came crashing down. And one of those things was the interior defensive line, Marcus Hunt, who obviously got released, and then Danico Autry, who went from 9.5 sacks to 3.5 sacks. And he played in more games. And so something happened there, but maybe it was something where, maybe it was just kind of a fluke season. Maybe if, with these other players that the Colts have now, can give Autry more one-on-ones and he can get more sacks, get more production. But he's proven that he can get after the quarterback. Last year was just a weird year in terms of that for Autry. Obviously, what can you say? Justin Houston undoubtedly was the best Colts defensive lineman last year, bar none. Great run defender, and also had 11 sacks. So that was a definitely refreshing thing to see from Houston. Another guy who showed tremendous flashes and potential was Kemoko Turay. I remember, Andrew, I think we were in a group chat. I think it was after, or maybe it was during that first regular season game against the Chargers. I don't remember if it was you or Derek, but you basically said, Cody, you were right on Kemoko Turay. This guy is a stud. This guy, he was just absolutely a game wrecker in those games that he played. And he played a key factor in that upset win at Kansas City. Unfortunately, that was a game that he went down with that ankle injury. That was a gruesome injury. But hopefully he comes back. He's a young player now. Was drafted in 2018 with a historic draft. And he's been working with Robert Mathis and stuff like that. So he's probably your best, I would say, from a defensive end standpoint. He's definitely your best pure pass rusher. And then there's some other guys, man, that we don't really know a whole lot about. I guess some guys. I guess I could start with the guy we know a little bit more about, being Grover Stewart. He's the guy, man, that he came in. He really I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how I felt about Grover Stewart going into 2019. He hadn't really seen the field a lot, but Marcus Hunt got benched, and I felt like Grover Stewart filled in pretty well. He's not going to get after the quarterback. I mean, he only had 4 sacks. He's more of your big body run stuffer, but he's a guy, man, that I really like. He's a young guy, was only drafted in 2017, a few years ago. He's a young guy to build around as well. And then you got some more unknown guys here with Ben Banigou, who's a guy that I was really high on last year. He showed some flashes and potential, but didn't really put it all together. But I'm excited to see how he progresses as a pass rusher and a defensive end. And then also one guy that's kind of been a disappointment up to this time, drafted in 2018 in the second round, as well as Taekwon Lewis. He's a guy, man, that it's been a weird couple of years for Taekwon Lewis. Obviously, in his rookie year, he was injured pretty much the entire season. Came back for that Dallas game, I think, and had 2 sacks. And we're like, holy smokes, this guy's good. And then really didn't do a ton to finish off the season. He had some decent games there. Then 2019, for whatever reason, he was a healthy scratch a lot of times. And the Colts even said, we need to see more in practice from Taekwon. And Chris Ballard even talked about, man, he said, Taekwon and I had a long talk after the season. And I told him, man, this is a big year for you. He said he had a conversation with Taekwon Lewis just about that stuff. And also with Quincy Wilson, another guy former second round pick who hasn't lived up to his potential yet. But there's some potential there. Like the Colts have invested some picks into these guys, right? And I think just the bringing in DeForest Buckner, I believe he was 6th overall when he was drafted by the 49ers a few years ago. So the Colts have a lot of guys here that they've invested decent round picks into. So there's guys with talent on this defensive line. And even if some of these guys, Taekwon Lewis, Ben Banigou, Kamoko Toure, don't really do a ton here in 2020, I still believe that the Colts have the best defensive line amongst the AFC South, especially if you were to bring in a guy like Jadeveon Clowney, Everson Griffin, one of those guys. That just adds to this group and just gives you even a better offensive line and better depth among the defensive line, I should say. And then it brings up the question, what do you do with Jabal Sheard? Do you bring Jabal Sheard back? If the Colts bring back Jabal Sheard, he's a solid player. He's not spectacular, but he can really help you on the rundowns. But here, Andrew, is my kind of defense for why I believe the Colts have the best defensive line out of the AFC South. And I think it's yes, they upgraded with DeForest Buckner. For sure, undoubtedly, he makes their defensive line a lot better and their defense as a whole a lot better. But I look at some of the moves in the AFC South, and I'll start here with Tennessee. Tennessee traded away Jarrell Casey for basically nothing, a late-round pick for Jarrell Casey. He's been a player that's been with the Titans and been a fantastic player with the Titans for a long time. The Titans basically, cut ties with him, traded him away to the Broncos. I know they drafted Jeffrey Simmons last year, so they believe in Simmons. But, I just look at it right now, and I just kind of look at this Titans defensive line, and I don't really see a DeForest Buckner type player. If I had to say a player that would even come close, it would have been Casey, but now he's out of the AFC South and out of the Titans organization. So I just don't see a lot of right now as it stands, Pro Bowl, all-pro level on that Titans defensive line, really anywhere right now. You could argue Jeffrey Simmons, but he hasn't really proven anything yet. So that's kind of my defense for the Titans there. And then moving on to the Jaguars, it's a little more interesting to me because you got this guy, Yannick Ngakoue, who has literally posted on Twitter, I do not want to be back in Jacksonville. But the Jaguars obviously franchise tagged him. And he's a guy that I would presume will probably not be on the Jaguars in 2020, but you never know. Maybe he plays and is just disgruntled in 2020, but I'm under the assumption that he's going to be traded away for something at some point, and he won't be on the Jaguars. So, if Ngakoue is gone, then you have Josh Allen, who admittedly had a really good rookie season, 10.5 sacks, was fantastic as a rookie. And then you got Taven Bryan, who had the Jaguars drafted a few years ago, defensive tackle. But, at this point, I look at Taven Bryan and I think he hasn't been a 16-game starter in his 2 years in the league. Maybe this is the year that he starts doing that. Obviously, Marcel Darius, they let go as well. They lost a lot on that defensive line the last couple of years. And there's a lot of just question marks and unproven. There's no guy that you can clearly look at unless you want to think about Ngakoue. But there's really no guy beyond that you look and say, this guy's going to win us football games. And I think that's the big reason why I would say I think the Colts right now have more proven guys, have less question marks among the defensive line. So that's why I would say there for Jacksonville. And then I'll move to Houston. It's crazy to me, Andrew, because a couple years ago, Houston, I would argue, had one of the best defensive lines in the league. But it's just kind of crazy how it's happened. Jadeveon Clowney got traded to the Seahawks this last year. And then DJ Reader, he left in free agency, a very good defensive tackle from Houston, still young guy. And really beyond that, like they have J.J. Watt, but J.J. Watt has not played in 16 games. He's played in 16 games one out of the last 4 seasons. And he's going to be 32 in May. He's the guy, man, that, he's been a fantastic player, game wrecker. As a Colts fan, I've seen him wreck so many games. But I look at it and say, Jadeveon Clowney is well past his prime now. He's had an injury history. Odds are, based off the last 4 years, he probably won't play all 16 games this year. And really, who else do you have? I mean, they drafted Charles Omenihu last year in the 5th round. Unproven guy, didn't really do a whole lot. There's not really a lot there that you see in Houston right now. And so I just think, man, this may be a little bit of a hot take, but I honestly think that as it stands right now, the Colts don't just have a better defensive line than any of the AFC South opponents. I would say they are leaps and bounds better on the defensive line than any of their AFC South opponents. As it stands right now, a month before the draft, I would say that. What are your thoughts, Andrew, here on the defensive line and kind of the things that I have walked through here with, the Colts defensive line compared to the other AFC South teams' defensive lines?
I mean, you really hit on pretty much everything, Cody. As you said, the Texans, oh, goodness gracious, we don't really know what they're doing on either side of the ball, honestly.
No.
But on the defensive line,
I don't think they know either.
Yeah, no, probably not. But on the defensive line specifically, they're, other than J.J. Watt, who you said hasn't really been healthy the last 4 or 5 seasons, they're a big bit of a question mark. The Jaguars trading, as you had mentioned, Calais Campbell away to the Ravens, and then Ngakoue wanting out, not even wanting to sign a long-term extension with Jacksonville. They're sort of cleaning house, I guess, defensively, trading away their top 2 corners as well, just to throw in another side note there. So that's kind of an interesting storyline to keep in mind as a Colts fan. And then you look at the Tennessee Titans trading away a 31-year-old defensive end, I believe, don't quote me there, and Jarrell Casey to the Denver Broncos. Oddly enough, for a 7th-round pick, I think that's kind of foolish. And then you have other guys like Daquan Jones, who's sort of kind of hit or miss. And then, as you said, you could argue maybe Jeffrey Simmons, but, he's second-year player, hasn't really proven much of anything. And I mean, I just completely agree, Cody. When you look at the amount of investment Chris Ballard has put into the Colts defensive line over the last 3 years, whether it be draft picks in Taekwon Lewis or Kamoko Toure or DeForest Buckner, or acquiring players via free agency, Jabal Sheard. He's just done an excellent job. And I couldn't agree more. I think the Colts are leaps and bounds in front of their AFC South rivals defensively.
Yeah, it's crazy because, like I mentioned, I would have never said that in the last couple of years. Like, I would say, if you had to make me choose an Achilles heel of the Colts from when Andrew Luck was drafted in 2012 up through this year, it was defensive line, unquestionably the defensive line, and unquestionably the offensive line. It was absolutely nuts, man, to even think about how the Colts thought how Ryan Grigson in particular thought that they were a Super Bowl team when they had one of the worst offensive lines and one of the worst defensive lines. But now it's crazy because Chris Ballard, this is something I love about Chris Ballard. I love this about Chris Ballard. Yeah, he's a human. He makes mistakes. We've seen that multiple times. 2017, I would argue he made a mistake with how he didn't really address the quarterback position with the uncertainty around Andrew Luck. Maybe you could count that against him. I would argue the Adam Vinatieri situation this last year. I was not a fan of that. Maybe you could even argue one that's a little bit closer here, what they've done with Jacoby Brissett. You could argue, why did you not trade him away and get the money that you could get from trading away Jacoby Brissett? Why would you pay him $7 million extra to be your backup quarterback? But for all of his faults, and Ballard said this I remember I've watched his intro press conference so many times, and Chris Ballard has said this time and time and time again. He said, I'm going to mess up. I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm going to own it. And I absolutely love that because Chris Ballard has owned it. He came in after the 2019 season, and I could tell he was hot. He was upset with himself. He's such a cool and collected guy most of the time, but deep down in there, he is one of the most competitive human beings I think that I've seen. And I can tell, he's the guy that he knew that defensive line was not up to par last year. He absolutely knew it, specifically the interior 3 technique. He knew that wasn't going to fly in 2020. What did he do? He traded for an all-pro Pro Bowl type player. And he also knew the quarterback position. He loved Jacoby Brissett, but he knew we have to upgrade here. We have to do something here. And obviously you can't address the defensive tackle position and also draft the guy at 13. You got to do one or the other. And Ballard chose trade away that 13th pick, acquire a player you believe can be one of the most dominant players in the league, and then sign Phillip Rivers, a guy that has familiarity with Frank Reich, has familiarity with Nick Sirianni, the offensive coordinator. And, sign him to a 1-year deal. Yeah, some people may be like, it's a little bit pricey, but it's a 1-year deal. So if Rivers doesn't pan out, you can move on. No problem. You can draft the guy next year or maybe sign another guy in free agency. But Ballard, he knows the weaknesses of his team, and he addresses them. It's so cool. I love that about Chris Ballard. He's not a guy that's going to stand pat. And, basically we saw this with Ryan Grigson. And even when he traded for Trent Richardson, he made Chuck Pagano play Trent Richardson, even though there were better players on the roster. And the thing I love about Ballard, he's not afraid to make a mistake. He has cut, he's cut a 4th-round pick. He's cut a 3rd-round pick. I mean, he cut Peter Desir, a guy who just re-signed. He's the guy that's willing to say, I'll make mistakes and I'll own them, but I'll make mistakes and I'll learn from them so that I don't make that mistake again and I make my team even better. I love that about Chris Ballard. I've always loved that ever since he was drafted. One of the most genuine guys in the league at the GM position, undoubtedly. A guy that I'm certainly, as a Colts fan, ecstatic to have in the building, ecstatic to have running the program, ecstatic to have making the personnel decisions. After so many years of misery, of watching the Colts go crazy in free agency, trade away valuable assets for players that are unproven, I just love it, man. I'm just a huge fan of it. Andrew, is there anything else, man, you want to touch on here with the offensive or defensive line before we wrap this podcast up?
There was something that I sort of missed when I was talking about the offensive line.
Sure.
When you look at the argument that we're making with the Colts having the best offensive line in football, I think there's a key component that I missed, and that's the national attention that they're getting, because you weren't getting that in the Grigson era. Because as you touched on, Cody, that was a complete disaster. Every offensive line position was a revolving door too often. Even talking about it just frustrates me a little bit because we don't have to go there. Anyways, like I said, you look at the national attention that the Colts are getting from the top shows like First Take, from Skip and Shannon Undisputed. When they mention the top offensive lines in football, it's no longer just the Cowboys and the Chiefs and all these other offensive lines that you could probably name, the Steelers. Most of them have mentioned the Colts before they mention anybody else, and that's big. That means that tells you 2 things. That tells you, one, that they're obviously living up to, I guess, expectations, if you will, and 2, Chris Ballard, as you mentioned, Cody, has done a phenomenal job with drafting these players, and like you said, he's a man of his word. I know we talked about this on one of our more recent podcasts. He saw that the Colts gave up, I think it was in 2017, 10 sacks to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that the offensive line just simply could not hold up. And he said, no, not again. I'm going to go. I'm going to address it. He did that this year with the defensive line. He saw the lack of interior pressure that the Colts were getting. And I've said this before on the podcast. When you run a defensive scheme like a Tampa 2, the primary pressure has to come from the interior. And if it doesn't, that hurts your secondary, and it's going to hurt you overall as a team. And that's exactly what we saw last season. And that was part of the Colts 7-9 finish. And that's one of the things that I love about Chris Ballard too. He's a man of his word, and when things need to be fixed and addressed, he's going to go do whatever he has to do to make sure that the things get addressed.
You look at the draft capital and the investment that Chris Ballard has made, a conscious effort to invest in the offense and defensive line. You look at it. I mean, I know he didn't draft Anthony Costanzo or Ryan Kelly. Those guys are first-round picks from different eras. It's kind of crazy. Different regimes drafted those guys in the first round. But he kept both of those guys. He's going to extend both of those guys. Drafted, obviously, Quentin Nelson at 6, and then went back in the second round of that same draft. He drafted Braden Smith in the second round. So basically all these guys outside of Mark Glowinski on the offensive line are first to second round picks. And on the defensive line, you look at it, DeForest Buckner, first round pick. Kamoko Turi, second round pick. Taekwon Lewis, second round pick. Ben Banogu, second round pick. Justin Houston. I mean, the Colts didn't pick him, but he was one of the higher, well-known pass rushers on the market last year. So you just see the investment that Chris Ballard is willing to make. And it just, he's a man of his word when he says, I believe that you win from the trenches. That's where you start. It's one thing when you say that. It's another thing when you put your money where your mouth is and you invest in it. I mean, we saw, Andrew, you talked about, I don't think putrid was a good enough word for that Colt offensive line for many years. Like you saw, what did Ryan Grigson do to invest in that offensive line? He was a former offensive lineman. I don't understand how he didn't understand that you protect your quarterback. I remember, Andrew, when the Colts drafted Philip Dorsett years and years ago, I was obviously ticked because I was like, why do you draft Dorsett at that point when you just signed Andre Johnson, when you have Dante Moncrief and T.Y. Hilton? Why would you do that? That makes no sense to me. And I remember putting out a tweet. I said, it's going to be hard for Andrew Luck to throw to his number 4 receiver that you drafted in the first round when he's getting sacked 50 times. And what happened? Andrew Luck got hurt and it didn't pan out. And the Colts went 8-8. And it's just such a different philosophy. And I just absolutely love that. I mean, Ryan Grigson did not invest in our offensive line until basically Jim Irsay said, you have to draft Ryan Kelly in the first round. And so I just love it, man. I just love what Chris Ballard has been doing. And that is the reason why I say the Colts have the best offensive line and defensive line in the AFC South. It comes from investment that Chris Ballard has made. And it also comes from talent and production and potential that we see on this offensive and defensive line. So I think that'll do it for this podcast. This is a really good one, man. I loved it. You have to apologize if you hear a little creak early on in the episode. My brother actually walked in and opened the door and it creaked a little bit. And so I was freaking out and telling him get out. So if you hear that, I apologize. I'll try to edit it out. But if you hear that, just ignore that. But yeah, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you guys so much for just your unwavering support. Honestly, it's crazy to me. I don't know, Andrew, if you've looked at how much traffic and how many subscribers we've been getting recently, but it was a little over a week ago. I remember I was sitting there. I was actually hanging out with my girlfriend, and we were looking, and I was talking to her about just the YouTube channel and stuff like that, and saying, yeah, we're a few subscribers away. I'm hoping to get to 1,000 subscribers today. And it's just so happened this was last Friday. We got to 1,000 subscribers, and it was amazing. March 13th, the day we got monetized, it was fantastic. Thank you guys so much for that support. But it's crazy, man, because I'm looking now at just the last week. We have put out so much content. I know I know Derek has. I know obviously you have come on and joined us a lot. But it's just been phenomenal. We've gained, man, from that last Friday, from March 13th now to when we're recording on March 22nd, we have gained over 100 subscribers here at 1,128, which is absolutely insane to me. Just so thankful to you guys for your unwavering support for us and your interaction. We love that you guys make different ideas with free agency happening and just your support of us. And we want to continue to provide content now. Obviously, a lot of people are quarantined in their homes, can't really do a whole lot. And so we want to try to provide as much Colts content as we can for you guys. Because I don't know about you, Andrew, but I'm a guy, man. When there's Colts content, I will listen to it. Like, I will purge just listening to Colts content. I remember a couple of years ago, I was sick for like an entire week. And I would even go back like weeks and weeks before and just listen to all these Colts podcasts and try to just keep entertained, keep busy, because it's such a boring time. So for those people who are quarantined, can't really go into work, we will try to get out as much content as we can. This podcast will come out on Monday, but we're recording it here on Sunday night, but it'll come out here on Monday. So you guys will be listening to it on Monday, probably Monday morning, Monday afternoon. But yeah, thanks guys so much. We really appreciate it as always. And as always, go Colts.